Hey guys, tonight we begin with the book of Numbers. You know, that part of the Bible everyone skips to get to the good stuff in Deuteronomy. Except nobody reads Deuteronomy either. So really, we're talking about the book people skip to get to literally anything else. It's got census data, genealogies, a talking donkey, and enough divine punishment to make you wonder if God woke up on the wrong side of the cloud pillar. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's something nobody tells you about Numbers. It's not actually about numbers. I mean, yes, there are 2 censuses. Detailed tribal rosters, precise measurements for tabernacle furniture arrangement, the kind of administrative minutiae that makes Excel spreadsheets look exciting. But here's what it really is. A 40-year case study in organizational collapse. Picture this. You've just pulled off the most dramatic liberation in human history. You've escaped slavery in Egypt, crossed a sea that split open like a divine emergency exit, received the law directly from God on a mountain that literally caught fire. You are the revolutionary movement, the scrappy underdog that defeated an empire. And now you're in the desert, counting people and arguing about who gets to carry the lampstand. Welcome to Numbers, the book where revolution becomes bureaucracy, and bureaucracy becomes a slow-motion disaster that takes 4 decades to fully collapse. The Israelites left Egypt as liberators. They'll enter Canaan as conquerors with detailed tax codes, and everything in between is this book. Let me set the scene. It's year 2 after the Exodus. The Israelites are camped at Mount Sinai, and Moses has a problem. Not the "we're out of water" problem, or the Pharaoh's chariots are gaining on us problem. Those were simple. This is the problem every revolutionary leader eventually faces. You've won. Now what? You've got roughly 600,000 men of military age, plus women, children, elderly folks, and that mixed multitude that tagged along because free beats slavery, even if the destination is unclear. That's maybe 2 million people camped in a desert with no infrastructure, no police force, no government buildings, and no HR department. Just tents, miles of tents, and the persistent smell of livestock, unwashed humans, and bread that's been the same recipe for 14 months straight. The manna knew its role. It had been doing this for over a year. So Moses does what every overwhelmed leader does when charisma stops working. He creates an organization chart. He takes a census, assigns tribal territories, establishes a professional priest class, writes detailed job descriptions for who carries what piece of sacred furniture and in what order. He turns liberation into administration. And this, friends, is where it all starts to fall apart. Because here's the thing about revolutionary movements. They run on momentum and shared purpose. Everyone's united against the common enemy. Everyone believes in the dream of the promised land. But once you're camped in the desert, filling out tribal registration forms, the cracks start showing. People complain about the food. Then they complain about Moses. Then they complain about each other. Moses' own siblings complain about his choice of wife, which is Bronze Age family drama at its finest. A guy named Korah decides he's had enough of Moses' leadership style and organizes a middle management coup. God responds by opening the earth and swallowing the rebels whole. The next day, the people complain that Moses murdered Korah. You literally cannot win. And through it all, God keeps adding rules, more purity regulations, procedures for handling corpse contamination, the ritual of the red heifer, which requires finding a perfectly red cow, burning it, mixing the ashes with water, and using that to purify people who touch dead bodies. It's a Bronze Age IKEA instruction manual, except the furniture is ceremonial and touching it wrong means death. What we're about to experience together is the slow-motion collapse of organizational morale. We'll watch a liberation movement turn into a bureaucracy, then watch that bureaucracy nearly tear itself apart through complaint, rebellion, and the kind of infighting that makes modern office politics look quaint. We'll see Moses go from confident leader to exhausted middle manager who hits a rock in frustration and gets banned from the promised land for it. We'll watch an entire generation die in the desert, one funeral at a time, until the second census reveals that almost everyone from the first census is gone. And here's the strange thing, the gentle irony that makes this book almost beautiful. By the end, this exhausted, traumatized, bureaucratically strangled movement will be creating property laws for a land they'll never enter, writing inheritance regulations for grandchildren they'll never meet, establishing cities of refuge for a society they're building in their imagination. The first generation spent 40 years wandering. The second generation spent 40 years preparing. And we're going to walk through every complaint, every rebellion, every bizarre ritual, and every moment where you can feel the whole thing threatening to collapse. Because Numbers isn't about numbers. It's about what happens when revolution meets reality, when the dream collides with logistics, when leaders lose control and organizations forget why they started. So settle in. We've got 40 years of wilderness ahead of us and a talking donkey. Trust me, we'll get there. You've just escaped slavery. You crossed a sea that split open like the world's most dramatic exit. You watched an empire's army drown behind you. You sang songs. You danced. You felt, for maybe the first time in your life, the electric possibility of freedom. And now? Now someone wants to count you. Not in a celebratory way. Not in a let's see how many of us made it way. In a bureaucratic, write your name down. Which tribe are you from? How old are you? Stand in that line kind of way. Welcome to Numbers Chapter 1. The book opens exactly 1 year after the Exodus. You're camped at Mount Sinai. You've received the 10 Commandments. You've built the tabernacle. That portable temple we'll discuss shortly. The revolutionary energy should still be fresh. You should be planning your triumphant march into Canaan, the land of milk and honey, the promised real estate that's been dangled in front of your ancestors for generations. Instead, God tells Moses to conduct a census. A census, the most thrilling administrative task known to humanity. Count every male 20 years old and older who can serve in the army, tribe by tribe, clan by clan. Write it all down. Make it official. You can almost hear the collective groan. The smell alone would have been memorable. A fragrant symphony of 60,000 families packed into a desert camp. A subtle blend of campfire smoke, unwashed wool, livestock, human sweat, and that indefinable scent of too many people living too close together for too long. You breathe through your mouth. It doesn't help. The air tastes like dust and yesterday's bread. But here's the thing about revolutions. They're fantastic at destroying old systems. They're terrible at replacing them. You've spent 400 years under Egyptian administration. You hated it. The quotas, the overseers, the endless record keeping of who made how many bricks. The Egyptians loved their lists. They had lists of lists. Bureaucracy was their art form. And now, barely a year into freedom, Moses is making lists. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. But Moses had a problem. Actually, Moses had about 600,000 problems, and they all needed to eat, sleep, settle disputes, and not kill each other. You can't run a nation on vibes alone. The Egyptians understood something that revolutionaries always learn too late. Control requires structure. Structure requires information. Information requires counting things. It's boring. It's tedious. It's absolutely necessary. So Moses counts. The numbers come back impressive. The tribe of Judah, 74,600 fighting men. Issachar, 54,400. Zebulun, 57,400. The list continues, tribe by tribe, each one a small army in itself. The total, 603,550 men of military age. If you include women, children, and the elderly, you're looking at somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. That's not a family. That's not even a tribe. That's a migration crisis with a divine mandate. Imagine trying to organize that many people in a desert. No cities, no infrastructure, no grocery stores, no postal system, no way to send a message except by literally walking to someone and talking to them. You need organization. You need hierarchy. You need someone to be in charge of the tent assignments, the water distribution, the livestock management, the conflict resolution, the latrine digging. You need, in other words, exactly the kind of administrative structure you just escaped from. Every revolution eventually becomes the thing it overthrew. It's not cynicism, it's gravity. The census divides everyone by tribe. 12 tribes, descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. Each tribe gets counted separately, organized separately, camped separately. This matters more than it seems. Back in Egypt, you were just slaves, undifferentiated labor. The Egyptians didn't care which tribe you belonged to. They cared whether you could carry bricks. But now your tribal identity is official, written down, counted. This creates something powerful. It creates categories, and categories create identity, and identity creates loyalty, and loyalty creates the possibility of organization. It also creates the possibility of conflict, but we'll get to that later. For now, Moses has his numbers. He knows how many fighting men each tribe can field. He knows who's who. He's turned a chaotic mass of refugees into something that looks, on papyrus at least, like an army. But he's not done. Because now we get to the Levites. The tribe of Levi, Moses' own tribe, doesn't get counted with the others. They get a special job. They're going to be the professional priest class. This is where it gets interesting. Back in Exodus, the idea was that everyone would be a kingdom of priests. Collective holiness, no intermediaries, direct access to the divine. That lasted approximately 5 minutes. Turns out, when you give everyone equal access to the sacred, chaos ensues. People start making golden calves. They start interpreting divine will in creative and contradictory ways. They start arguing about who's really in charge. So Moses does what every leader eventually does. He creates a professional class. The Levites will handle the holy stuff. Everyone else will handle the regular stuff. Clear divisions, clear responsibilities. No confusion. It's practical. It's necessary. It's also the exact opposite of the original vision. The gentle cynic in you notices the pattern. Every egalitarian movement eventually creates an elite. Every we're all equal revolution eventually decides that some people are more equal than others. Not because they're evil, because managing chaos requires specialization. The Levites get assigned very specific tasks, and this is where God's instructions become hilariously detailed. Chapter 3, verse 25. The Gershonites are responsible for the curtains of the tabernacle, the tent covering, the outer covering, the curtain for the entrance, and the ropes. Just the curtains, not the poles, not the bases, the curtains. chapter 4, verse 4. The Kohathites are responsible for the most holy things: the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altars, the sacred utensils. But, and this is critical, they can't touch them. Aaron and his sons have to cover everything first. If a Kohathite so much as glances at the holy objects before they're covered, he dies. Instant death. For looking. The rules continue with the precision of an IKEA assembly manual, written by someone who really doesn't want you to mess this up. The Merarites get the frames, the crossbars, the posts, the bases, the tent pegs, the ropes for the courtyard. Everything is assigned. Everything is specified. Nothing is left to chance. You can picture the scene. Moses standing there with his list, pointing at various Levites. You curtains, you poles, you tent pegs. And remember, don't touch the ark or you'll die. Questions? No? Great. Let's move this temple. Because that's what they're doing. They're moving a temple. The tabernacle isn't a building. It's a portable worship complex. A tent palace for God, designed to be assembled, disassembled, and carried through the desert. The instructions for building it took up 6 chapters in Exodus. The instructions for moving it take up most of Numbers 4. Every pole has a designated carrier. Every curtain has a designated folder. Every sacred object has a designated coverer and a designated transporter. It's Bronze Age logistics, and it's surprisingly sophisticated. Think about what they're attempting. They need to move a sacred space, complete with furniture, curtains, altars, and utensils, across a desert with no roads, no vehicles, and no margin for error. Everything has to arrive intact. Everything has to be set up exactly the same way at the next camp. The system can't fail, so they create procedures, checklists, assignments, backup plans. They turn worship into a process. The tabernacle itself is a fascinating artifact. It sits in the center of the camp. Every tribe camps around it in a specific arrangement. Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun to the east. Reuben, Simeon, and Gad to the south. Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin to the west. Dan, Asher, and Naphtali to the north. The Levites camp closest to the tabernacle, forming an inner ring of sacred buffer zone. From above, the camp would look like a giant cross, with the tabernacle at the center. This isn't accidental. This is design. When you're managing 2 million people, you can't let them camp randomly. Random camping creates random disputes. Who gets the good spots? Who's too close to the latrine? Who's blocking whose view? So you assign spots. Everyone knows where they belong. When the camp moves, everyone knows their position in the march. When they set up again, everyone knows where to go. It eliminates arguments. It creates predictability. It turns chaos into order. It also creates a visible hierarchy. The closer you camp to the tabernacle, the more important you are. The Levites are closest. The other tribes are arranged by precedence. Everyone knows their place. Literally. This is what administration does. It takes the messy reality of human relationships and turns it into a chart. You get a position, you get a role, you get a place in line. It's efficient. It's fair, in a mechanical sort of way. It's also profoundly unrevolutionary. Remember, these people were slaves a year ago. Slaves don't have positions. They have work. Endless, undifferentiated work. Freedom was supposed to mean the end of that. Freedom was supposed to mean autonomy, choice, the ability to chart your own path. But here they are, assigned to tribes, organized in ranks, given specific jobs, told exactly where to stand. The difference, and this matters, is that now the system is theirs. It's not imposed by foreign conquerors. It's not designed to extract labor for someone else's benefit. It's designed to help them survive, to help them function, to help them get from here to there. But it's still a system, and systems, by their nature, create insiders and outsiders, people with access and people without, people who carry the holy objects and people who die if they touch them. The Levites didn't ask for this job. Well, some of them probably did, but most of them inherited it. You're born a Levite, you're a Levite. You're born into Judah, you're in Judah. No transfers, no career changes, no opting out. Your tribe is your identity. Your role is your destiny. This would have felt normal to them. Ancient societies worked this way. You inherited your father's profession, your family's status, your tribe's obligations. But it's worth sitting with the irony. They escaped a system that assigned them roles based on birth, only to create a new system that assigns them roles based on birth. The content is different. The structure is identical. Now, let's talk about what happens when you actually move this operation. Chapter 2 describes the marching order. When the camp packs up to move, and they'll do this dozens of times over the next 40 years, there's a specific sequence. First, the tribes on the east side break camp. Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. They march out in formation. Then the Gershonites and Merarites, the Levites who carry the tabernacle structure, pack up and move out. They go ahead to the next campsite so they can set up the framework before the holy objects arrive. Then the tribes on the south side, Reuben, Simeon, Gad. Then the Kohathites, carrying the covered sacred objects. They arrive to find the structure already set up, ready to receive the holy items. Finally, the tribes on the west and north, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, then Dan, Asher, Naphtali. Dan brings up the rear, serving as a kind of rear guard, collecting anything left behind. The whole operation is choreographed like a military movement, which makes sense because it is a military movement. They're not tourists, they're an invasion force preparing to conquer territory. But they're also a worship community, and that's the tension at the heart of Numbers. Are they an army or a congregation? A nation or a church? A political entity or a religious movement? The answer, frustratingly, is yes. They're trying to be all of it at once. A people defined by their relationship with God, organized for war, governed by religious law, structured like a nation-state. It's an ambitious project. Historically, it doesn't go well, but we'll get to that. For now, they have their census, they have their organization, they have their marching orders. They've transformed from a liberated slave population into something that looks, at least on papyrus, like a functional society. The revolution has become an administration. Moses stands at the center of it all, holding his lists, managing his Levites, trying to keep 600,000 men and their families organized, fed, and moving in the same direction. He's no longer a liberator, he's a manager. And management, as anyone who's ever managed anything knows, is where dreams go to fill out paperwork. The exciting part is over. The sea has parted. The enemy has drowned. The mountain has spoken. Now comes the hard part, actually building something that lasts. The tabernacle sits in the center of the camp, covered and ready to move. The tribes are arranged around it in their designated positions. The Levites know their jobs. The census is complete. Everything is in order. Everything is under control. And if there's one thing history teaches us, it's this. The moment everything seems under control is the moment just before everything falls apart. But Moses doesn't know that yet. For now, he has his numbers. He has his structure. He has his plan. The desert stretches ahead, vast and empty and waiting. 40 years waiting, as it turns out. But they don't know that either, Congratulations. You've survived the census. You've watched an entire liberation movement get reorganized into a spreadsheet. The Israelites are now neatly arranged by tribe, with assigned camping positions and a professional priest class to handle the holy furniture. And now comes the hard part. Managing human behavior. See, you can count people. You can organize them into tribes. You can even designate specific families to carry specific pieces of the tabernacle using specific types of poles. But you cannot, and this is where things get interesting, you cannot actually make 600,000 people behave themselves. No police force, no courts, no jails. Just Moses, some elders, and the growing suspicion that divine intervention isn't going to micromanage every interpersonal conflict. So they did what every society does when it can't control behavior directly. They created rituals that felt like control. Welcome to Numbers chapters 5 and 6, where we meet the trial by bitter water and the Nazirite vow. Two spectacularly different attempts to manage the uncontrollable through the power of religious theatre. Let's start with the purity laws, because before you can have a functional camp of 600,000 people, you need to establish who gets to stay and who has to leave. Chapter 5 opens with God telling Moses to send away anyone with skin diseases, unusual bodily discharges, or corpse contamination. A Bronze Age quarantine policy. Practical, really. When you're living in close quarters, tents packed shoulder to shoulder, family groups clustered around tribal standards, disease spreads fast. The smell alone would have been instructive. 600,000 people, desert heat, limited water for bathing. You catch a whiff of someone's tent and you think, that's not normal bread and body odor. That's something dying. So out they go. Not permanently, just until they're clean. The text is specific about this. Skin disease. Out. Discharge. Out. Touch the corpse. Out. You camp outside the community until you're ritually pure again. Which sounds harsh until you remember the alternative. Let disease run unchecked through a population that has nowhere to run. Watch it spread from tent to tent, family to family, tribe to tribe. The purity laws weren't cruel. They were the only epidemiology available. But here's where it gets interesting. The laws don't just cover physical contamination. They cover social contamination too. Wronging your neighbor, stealing, breaking trust. And there's a ritual for that. If you've wronged someone, you confess. You make restitution, the full value of what you took, plus 20%, a Bronze Age fine system. Then you bring a ram to the priest for atonement. The ram knew its role. It had been doing this for generations. The logic: if you can't police every transaction, every theft, every broken promise, you create a system where confession and restitution are publicly ritualized. The wrongdoer pays extra. The community witnesses. The priest mediates. Everyone knows the cost of betrayal. And if the wrong person is dead, if there's no family to receive restitution, the payment goes to the priest, which was convenient for the priesthood and slightly suspicious for everyone else. But fine, manageable. You've established quarantine protocols and a restitution system. You're building something that resembles social order. And then we get to Numbers chapter 5 verse 11, the jealousy ordeal. Deep breath. This is where things get spectacularly weird. Picture this. A man suspects his wife of adultery. He has no proof, no witnesses, just suspicion. Maybe she was seen talking to someone. Maybe she came home late. Maybe he's just paranoid and controlling. And this seemed like a reasonable way to handle marital anxiety in the Bronze Age. He can't prove anything. But the suspicion is eating him alive. And her. And probably everyone in their extended family who has to live in adjacent tents and listen to the accusations. So Moses introduces a ritual, the trial by bitter water, a Bronze Age lie detector test administered by priests with a flair for psychological theatre. Here's how it works. The husband brings his wife to the priest. He brings a grain offering, barley flour specifically, no oil, no incense. A jealousy offering, the text calls it, an offering of remembrance, bringing iniquity to mind. The barley flour sits there looking plain and slightly accusatory. It knows what it represents. The priest takes the woman and makes her stand before the Lord, before the tabernacle, in front of everyone. Public ritual, maximum social pressure. Then he unbinds her hair. In a culture where married women kept their hair covered, this is significant, humiliating, a visual marker that she's being stripped of her status, her dignity, her protection. She stands there, hair loose, holding the grain offering, while the entire community watches. The priest, meanwhile, prepares the bitter water. He takes holy water, water from the bronze basin, the one used for priestly washings. He adds dust from the tabernacle floor, dust that's been walked on by priests, by worshippers, by animals being led to slaughter. Dust mixed with ash, with spilled blood, with whatever accumulated on a floor that saw daily sacrifices. You can see it swirling in the water, little particles suspended catching the light. It doesn't look medicinal. It looks exactly like what it is. Dirt water with symbolic weight. But wait, there's more. The priest writes out the curses, the specific consequences if she's guilty, on a scroll. Then he washes the ink off into the bitter water. The ink dissolves, spreads, turns the water darker. Now she's holding a cup of holy water mixed with tabernacle floor dust and dissolved cursing. A cocktail designed not to poison, but to psychologically devastate. The priest makes her take an oath. He spells out the consequences. If you're innocent, this water won't harm you. If you're guilty, may your womb swell and your thigh rot. May you become a curse among your people. Thigh rot. The text actually says that. Biblical Hebrew for reproductive consequences that everyone understood, but nobody wanted to describe in detail. Then she drinks. She stands there, hair unbound, holding the jealousy offering, and drinks the bitter water in front of the priest, her husband, and anyone else who's gathered to watch. And then, nothing. She goes home. Everyone waits. If her belly swells, if she shows any signs of illness or miscarriage, she's guilty. The curse has taken effect. She becomes a social pariah, a warning to other women, a vindication for her suspicious husband. If nothing happens, she's innocent. She goes back to her life. Her husband has to live with the fact that he publicly humiliated her over nothing. Either way, the priest has performed his function. The ritual has provided an answer, or the illusion of an answer. Because let's be honest about what's actually happening here. This isn't a medical test. This isn't divine intervention sorting the guilty from the innocent. This is a Bronze Age polygraph that works entirely through psychological pressure and social theatre. The water itself, harmless. Dust and ink won't cause reproductive failure, but stress will, public humiliation will. The psychological weight of standing before your community, drinking a curse, waiting to see if your body betrays you, that will absolutely cause physical symptoms, psychosomatic responses. We know this now. The mind affects the body. Anxiety causes nausea, cramping, irregular cycles. A woman convinced she's been cursed, standing in front of a community that's watching for signs of guilt, might very well develop symptoms. And if she's pregnant from an affair, the stress alone could trigger a miscarriage. The bitter water gets credit. The system works. But here's the thing. The ritual wasn't designed to catch adultery. It was designed to resolve suspicion. Because you can't have 600,000 people living in tents with unresolved accusations poisoning family units. You can't have husbands and wives locked in endless suspicion with no mechanism for resolution. So you create theatre. You create a ritual that feels official, that invokes divine authority, that provides closure. Guilty or innocent, the ordeal ends the accusation. The husband can't keep bringing it up. The community has witnessed the resolution. The case is closed. Was it just? Absolutely not. The woman bore all the risk, all the humiliation, all the physical and social consequences. The man just had to show up with barley flour and suspicion. Was it effective? Probably. As a tool for managing marital conflict in a society with no other legal mechanism for resolving domestic disputes. The bitter water knew its role. It had been doing this since someone first realized that you can't police private behavior, but you can create public rituals that make people think twice. And then, just to make sure we're thoroughly confused about the relationship between bodily control and holiness, Numbers chapter 6 introduces the Nazirite vow, a voluntary commitment to extreme purity, the opposite of the jealousy ordeal. Instead of being forced into a ritual, you choose one. The rules: no wine, no grapes, not even grape juice or raisins, nothing from the vine, no haircuts, no contact with corpses. Even if your own parent dies, you don't touch the body. For a set period of time, you separate yourself. You become visibly, obviously, inconveniently holy. The hair is the marker. In a culture where everyone else cuts their hair, you let yours grow, long, unbound. A walking advertisement that you've taken a vow. People see you coming and they know. That's a Nazirite. Don't offer them wine. Don't invite them to funerals. Don't ask them to help move Uncle Jacob's body. The vow could last weeks, months, years. Some people, Samson, Samuel, were Nazirites for life. But most people took temporary vows, a spiritual retreat with visible accountability. And when the vow ended, you went to the tabernacle for the completion ritual. You brought offerings, a lamb, a ram, a basket of unleavened bread. The priest performed the sacrifices, and then, this is the part that must have hurt, the priest shaved your head. All that hair, months or years of growth, gone. But you didn't just throw it away. You took the hair and burned it in the fire under the peace offering. Your hair, offered to God. The physical evidence of your commitment, consumed in flames. It's almost beautiful. Almost. Until you remember that this is happening in a desert camp, where most people are eating manna and wondering when they'll see the promised land. And someone over there is burning their hair as a sacrifice because they took a voluntary purity vow. The contrast is instructive. On one hand, you have the jealousy ordeal, forced participation, public humiliation, a woman with no choice drinking bitter water while her community watches. On the other hand, you have the Nazirite vow, voluntary separation, personal commitment, a public display of devotion that you choose. Same society, same moment. Two completely different approaches to managing behavior through ritual. The cynic in me wants to point out the obvious. One ritual controls women. The other elevates individuals who want to signal their holiness. But that's too simple. Because both rituals serve the same function. They create visible markers of social status and spiritual commitment in a community that desperately needs structure. The woman who survives the bitter water returns to her husband with her innocence publicly validated. The Nazirite who completes the vow returns to normal life with enhanced social status. Both have been through an ordeal. Both emerge transformed. The rituals don't actually control behavior. They can't. You can't stop adultery with dust water. You can't enforce holiness with a haircut ban, but you can create systems that make people believe behavior is being controlled. You can establish consequences, real or perceived, that make people think twice. You can build social pressure that does the work divine intervention can't. That's what's happening here. In the absence of courts, police, or any mechanism for enforcing social norms, Moses is building a ritual infrastructure, purity laws that quarantine disease, restitution requirements that address theft, a jealousy ordeal that resolves marital suspicion, a voluntary vow that lets people signal devotion. None of it is pretty, none of it would survive modern ethical review, but all of it serves a function. It creates the illusion of control in a situation that is fundamentally uncontrollable. 600,000 people, desert, tents, limited resources, no infrastructure. Just Moses, some priests, and an increasingly elaborate system of rituals designed to manage human chaos. The bitter water sits in its basin, waiting. The barley flour gets measured out for the next jealousy offering. Someone's hair continues growing, marking time on a Nazirite vow. And somewhere, a woman stands with her hair unbound, holding dust water, wondering if her body will betray her. The rituals endure, long after anyone remembers why they started, long after the original function fades into tradition. We see them not as primitive attempts at social control, but as sacred mysteries, ancient wisdom, divine commands, which they were, and also weren't. They were what every society creates when it can't control behavior directly: theater, pressure, ritual weight, the Bronze Age equivalent of a security camera that may or may not be recording. You don't know if it works, but you act differently because it's there. The bitter water knew this. It had always known. Let's talk about complaints, not the casual kind, not the "this coffee's lukewarm" kind. We're talking about the deep, organizational, everyone is miserable, and it's definitely someone else's fault kind of complaining. The kind that starts with legitimate grievances and ends with the entire nation, wandering in circles for 40 years. Welcome to Numbers chapters 11 through 14. The complaint machine is warming up, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. You're in year 2 of the wilderness journey. The census is complete. The organizational charts are drawn. The Levites know which sacred curtain they're responsible for. Everything is structured, official, bureaucratic. And the people? They hate it. They hate the food. They hate the leadership. They hate each other's spouses. They hate the destination. They hate the plan. This is what organizational collapse looks like in real time. Let's start with the food situation. The people have been eating manna for about a year now. Manna, if you recall, is the mysterious bread-like substance that appears every morning with the dew. It tastes like wafers made with honey. It's free, it's reliable. It appears 6 days a week without fail. And they're absolutely sick of it. Chapter 11 opens with what scholars politely call the complaint at Taberah. The people are grumbling. The Hebrew word suggests a low, continuous murmur, like the hum of collective discontent in an open-plan office. God's response? Fire. Not metaphorical fire. Actual fire. The outskirts of the camp just ignite. The people cry out to Moses. Moses prays. The fire stops. They name the place Taberah, which means burning, because apparently the best way to remember almost being incinerated for complaining is to name the location after the thing that almost killed you. You'd think this would solve the complaint problem. It does not solve the complaint problem, because almost immediately we get the real complaint, the big one, the complaint that reveals what's actually happening beneath the surface. The rabble, and the text specifically identifies them as the rabble, the mixed multitude of non-Israelites who joined the Exodus, start craving meat, and their craving spreads like a virus through the camp. Picture the scene. You're sitting outside your tent. The sun is setting over the desert. Someone nearby sighs loudly and says, "Remember fish?" And suddenly, you do remember fish. You remember the fish in Egypt, free fish. You didn't have to pay for it. You just had fish and cucumbers and melons, leeks, onions, garlic. Your mouth is watering now. You're thinking about the crunch of a fresh cucumber, the sharp bite of raw onion, the sweetness of melon on a hot day. And then you look down at the manna again, the same manna you ate yesterday and the day before, and every single day for the past year. It's not that manna is bad. It's that manna is all there is. And the human brain, it turns out, doesn't do well with all there is. We're designed for variety, for seasons, for the irregular pleasure of different tastes. We're designed for anticipation and surprise. Manna offers neither. So the people weep. Not quiet, dignified tears. They weep loudly, publicly, each at the entrance to their tent. This is important. They're not hiding their misery. They're performing it, making sure everyone knows they're unhappy, making sure Moses knows. And Moses hears all of it. Imagine being Moses in this moment. You've led these people out of slavery. You've watched the sea split. You've climbed the mountain, received the law, organized the entire nation into a functioning system. You've done everything right. And they're weeping because they miss Egyptian fish they ate as slaves. Moses does what any leader does when the complaints become unbearable. He complains to his boss. His conversation with God in verses 11 through 15 is one of the most honest moments in the entire Bible. Moses doesn't use religious language. He doesn't pray diplomatically. He melts down. "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant?" he asks. "What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me?" He continues, "Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms, as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors?" Translation: These are your people, not mine. I didn't sign up to be their mother. Then comes the kicker. Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, "Give us meat." I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. And then, the line that every burned-out leader has thought, but rarely says out loud. "If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me, if I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." Moses, the great prophet, the liberator, the guy who talks to God face to face, has just asked to be fired via death. This is what happens when charismatic leadership meets organizational reality. Moses was excellent at the visionary stuff. The dramatic confrontations with Pharaoh, the sea-splitting moments, the mountaintop revelations. But daily management of 600,000 complaining people? That requires a different skill set, a skill set Moses doesn't have. God's solution is practical and slightly hilarious. He tells Moses to gather 70 elders, and he'll distribute some of Moses' spirit to them so they can help carry the burden. This is the Bronze Age equivalent of, you need to delegate, but God's not done. He's also going to address the meat situation. And this is where things get weird. God tells Moses to tell the people, "You want meat? Fine. You'll have meat. Not for 1 day or 2 days or 5, 10 or 20 days. You'll have meat for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils, until you loathe it." Moses, even in his exhausted state, recognizes this sounds insane. "Here I am among 600,000 men on foot," he says, "and you say, 'I will give them meat to eat for a whole month.' Would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them?" God's response is essentially, "Watch me." And then the wind comes. A wind from the Lord drives quail in from the sea. Not a few quail, not a reasonable number of quail. Quail 3 feet deep, covering an area roughly 30 miles in every direction. The people go out and gather quail. All that day, all night, all the next day. The person who gathered the least collected about 60 bushels. 60 bushels of quail. They spread them out all around the camp, presumably to dry or preserve them. The camp smells like a Bronze Age poultry processing facility. And then, while the meat is still between their teeth, before they've even finished chewing, God sends a plague. The place gets named Kibroth Hatava, graves of craving, because that's where they buried the people who craved meat. The gentle cynic observes, "This is not how you address employee morale issues. When your workforce says the food situation is untenable and your response is fine, have so much food it kills you, you haven't solved the problem. You've just made everyone more afraid to complain, which doesn't eliminate complaints. It just drives them underground, where they fester and emerge in unexpected ways, like, for instance, through your own family." Chapter 12 opens with Miriam and Aaron talking about Moses, specifically about his Cushite wife. The text is maddeningly vague about the details. Is this Zipporah, the Midianite woman Moses married back in chapter 2 of Exodus? Is this a second wife? Is Cushite a description of ethnicity or a veiled insult? We don't know. What we do know is that Miriam and Aaron are using Moses' marriage as a proxy for their real complaint. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? This is a power play. Miriam is a prophet. Aaron is the high priest. They're not random complainers. They're the original leadership team. They were there before the organizational charts, before the census, before the Levites got their special status, and now Moses is treating them like middle management. The text tells us the Lord heard this, which is ominous phrasing. It suggests God wasn't supposed to hear this. This was a private conversation. But in a camp of 600,000 people, there are no private conversations. God summons all 3 of them to the tent of meeting. And then he does something interesting. He doesn't address the marriage question at all. He goes straight to the authority issue. He explains that he speaks to other prophets in visions and dreams. But with Moses, he speaks face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. Then he asks, "Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" The anger of the Lord burns against them. The cloud lifts from the tent. And when it does, Miriam has leprosy. Not Aaron, just Miriam, which tells you something about who God thought was leading this particular rebellion. Aaron immediately begs Moses for mercy, using language that suggests he knows exactly how bad this is. "Please, my Lord, I ask you not to hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed." Moses, to his credit, doesn't gloat. He doesn't say, "I told you so." He cries out to God, "Please, God, heal her." God's response is surprisingly measured. If her father had spit in her face, the ultimate sign of disgrace, wouldn't she be shamed for 7 days? So confine her outside the camp for 7 days, and then she can return. Miriam spends a week outside the camp. The entire nation waits for her. They don't move on without her. And the text makes sure we know this. The people did not move on till she was brought back. It's a small detail, but it matters because it shows that despite all the complaints, despite the organizational chaos, despite the power struggles, there's still something holding these people together. They wait for Miriam. But the waiting doesn't solve the deeper problem. The deeper problem is this. Nobody actually wants to go to Canaan. Oh, they say they do. They talk about the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the inheritance God swore to their ancestors. But when it comes time to actually go there, to face the giants and the fortified cities and the reality of conquest, they'd rather complain about manna. Chapter 13 is where this becomes obvious. They've reached Kadesh Barnea, on the southern border of Canaan. They're right there. After 2 years of wandering, organizing, complaining, and plague dodging, they've arrived at the threshold. God tells Moses to send spies into the land, 1 leader from each tribe, 12 men total. This seems reasonable. Standard military reconnaissance. Moses gives them clear instructions. Check out the land, see what it's like. Are the people strong or weak? Few or many? Is the land good or bad? Are the towns fortified or unwalled? Is the soil fertile or poor? Are there trees? And then he adds, do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. It's grape season, so off they go. 12 spies, 40 days. They scout the entire land from the desert of Zin to Rehob, near Lebo Hamath. They go up through the Negev and come to Hebron, where the descendants of Anak live. The Anakites, giants. This detail will matter. When they reach the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. The cluster is so large, it takes 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. 2 men, 1 cluster of grapes. They also bring back pomegranates and figs. After 40 days, they return to the camp at Kadesh. The entire assembly gathers. Everyone wants to hear the report, and the spies deliver. We went into the land to which you sent us, they say, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. They show the massive grape cluster, the pomegranates, the figs. Everyone can see the evidence. The land is exactly what God promised. Rich, fertile, abundant. But there's always a but. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. They continue listing obstacles. Amalekites in the Negev, Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites in the hill country, Canaanites along the coast and the Jordan. The energy in the camp shifts. You can feel it, the excitement draining away like water into sand. One of the spies, Caleb, tries to salvage the moment. He silences the people before Moses and says, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the other spies contradict him immediately. We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And then they spread what the text calls a bad report. They tell the Israelites, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Grasshoppers. That's how they saw themselves. Not as the people who watched Egypt's army drown in the sea. Not as the nation God had organized, protected, and fed for 2 years. As grasshoppers. The entire assembly responds exactly as you'd expect. They weep. All night long, they weep. And then, in the morning, the real complaints begin. If only we had died in Egypt, they cry, or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And then someone says what everyone's thinking. We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. This is mutiny. Not veiled criticism, not grumbling about food, actual mutiny. They're proposing to elect a new leader and reverse the entire Exodus. Moses and Aaron fall face down in front of the whole assembly. Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who disagreed with the bad report, tear their clothes, the ancient gesture of grief and horror, and they make one last appeal. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good, they say. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. It's a good speech, passionate, logical, theologically sound. The assembly's response. They talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. This is how far things have deteriorated. The people are ready to execute the messengers who brought the truthful report. And then the glory of the Lord appears at the tent of meeting. Everyone sees it. God speaks to Moses, and his question is weary, almost resigned. How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? He proposes to strike them with a plague, destroy them, and make Moses into a greater nation. It's the same offer he made after the golden calf incident. And Moses, once again, talks him down. But this time, Moses' argument is different. He doesn't appeal to God's reputation among the Egyptians. He appeals to God's own self-description. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion. He's quoting God's own words back to him. It works. God forgives them. But forgiveness, it turns out, doesn't mean there are no consequences. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, God says, except Caleb and Joshua. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in this wilderness. 40 days of spying, 40 years of wandering, 1 year for each day. The entire generation that came out of Egypt, everyone 20 years old or more who was counted in the census, will die in the wilderness. They wanted to die in the wilderness instead of facing Canaan. Fine, they'll get their wish. The spies who spread the bad report, they die immediately, plague. Only Joshua and Caleb survive. And here's where the organizational psychology gets fascinating. The people hear this judgment and immediately regret everything. We have sinned, they say. We will go up to the place the Lord promised. Early the next morning, they head up toward the hill country. We have sinned, they repeat. We will go up to the place the Lord promised. Moses tries to stop them. Why are you disobeying the Lord's command? This will not succeed. Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. You will be defeated by your enemies. But they don't listen. They go up anyway. Presumptuous, the text calls them. They go up without Moses, without the Ark of the Covenant, without God's presence, and the Amalekites and Canaanites who lived in that hill country come down and attack them, beat them down all the way to Hormah. It's a complete disaster. The gentle cynic observes, this is what happens when compliance replaces belief. For 40 days, the spies explored Canaan. They saw the evidence. They brought back proof. And 10 of them decided the evidence didn't matter because they were afraid. They convinced everyone else to be afraid too. And when God said, fine, you're not ready, they immediately switched to, no, we're totally ready, we'll go right now. Not because they believed, because they were trying to avoid consequences. But consequences don't work that way. You can't undo organizational collapse. by suddenly pretending to have confidence you don't actually possess. The people didn't trust God enough to enter Canaan when he said go, and they didn't trust him enough to stay when he said stop. They just reacted to fear, to judgment, to shame, to each other. This is what the breakdown of organizational morale looks like. Not a single dramatic failure, a cascade, a series of small losses of trust that compound until nobody believes in the mission anymore. The census in chapter 1 organized everyone by tribe and family. It created structure, hierarchy, roles. But structure without trust is just paperwork. And by chapter 14, trust is gone. Moses has lost credibility with the people. The people have lost credibility with God. The leadership team has fractured. The workforce wants to elect new management and return to Egypt. The 40-year wandering isn't divine punishment for a single act of disobedience. It's what happens when an organization loses its sense of purpose and has to wait for an entire generation to cycle out before it can function again. It's what happens when the people who remember Egypt, who remember slavery but also remember fish, have to die off before the people who only know freedom can move forward. The first generation couldn't enter Canaan because they couldn't stop looking backward. They spent 2 years organizing for a future they didn't actually want. And now they'll spend 40 years wandering in circles, dying slowly, while their children prepare for a conquest they'll never see. Every complaint in these 4 chapters was legitimate on some level. The manna situation was monotonous. Moses was overwhelmed. The Canaanites were genuinely intimidating. But legitimate complaints don't automatically produce good outcomes. Sometimes they just produce more complaints, until everyone is so busy complaining they forget what they were supposed to be doing in the first place. The complaint machine, once started, doesn't easily stop. It just runs and runs, burning through credibility and hope and organizational momentum until there's nothing left but time. 40 years of it, in the wilderness, where the only thing that changes is who's still alive to complain. We are approximately 38 years into this wilderness experiment. The liberation movement has calcified into bureaucracy. The revolutionary fervor has been replaced by census forms and purity regulations. And somewhere in this organizational morass, a man named Korah is looking at the org chart and thinking, this seems unfair. Korah was a Levite, not just any Levite, a Kohathite, which meant his family had the prestigious job of carrying the most sacred furniture when the camp moved. The Ark of the Covenant, the altars, the holy implements. These weren't just religious objects. They were the physical symbols of God's presence, the tangible proof that this whole operation had divine backing. Korah's job was important, visible, the kind of position that comes with status but not actual authority. And that's where the problem started, because above Korah in the hierarchy sat Aaron and his sons, who got to be the actual priests. They wore the fancy clothes. They entered the Holy of Holies. They made the sacrifices and received portions of the offerings. Aaron's family had been granted a hereditary monopoly on accessing God, and Korah, who came from the same tribe, who did sacred work, who was frankly just as qualified, had to watch from the outside. The organizational structure was clear. Moses had political authority, Aaron had religious authority, and everyone else had the privilege of following orders. Korah looked at this arrangement and saw what you would see. Concentrated power justified by claims of divine appointment. He wasn't wrong. So Korah organized. He gathered 250 leaders, men of renown, the text calls them, which is ancient Hebrew for people whose opinions actually mattered in the community. These weren't random complainers. They were tribal leaders, assembly members, the kind of influential figures whose support you needed for anything to function. Korah's pitch was elegant in its simplicity. The whole community is holy, every one of them. God is with all of us. So why do you, Moses and Aaron, set yourselves above the Lord's assembly? This is a legitimately good argument, theologically sound even. Hadn't God said the whole nation was meant to be a kingdom of priests? Hadn't the entire liberation narrative been about escaping Pharaoh's hierarchy? And now here they were, recreating the same power structure with different people at the top. The problem with Korah's rebellion wasn't the logic. The problem was the timing, the method, and the fact that he was challenging a leader who had God's direct phone number. Moses heard this challenge and immediately fell face down, not in fear, in exhaustion. You can almost hear the internal monologue. Not this, not today. I have been managing 600,000 people in a desert for nearly 40 years. I have mediated between them and God. I have dealt with complaints about food, water, leadership, my marriage, and the fundamental question of whether this entire project was worth it. And now middle management wants a power-sharing agreement. But Moses, to his credit, didn't immediately smite anyone. Instead, he proposed a test. Tomorrow morning, everyone brings incense and fire pans to the tent of meeting. You stand before the Lord with your offerings, and we'll see whom God chooses. It's a theological showdown. Divine selection by fire hazard. The setup is important here. Incense offerings were Aaron's job, exclusively. Approaching God with unauthorized fire was explicitly forbidden. Aaron's own sons had died doing exactly this earlier in the journey. So Moses is essentially saying, you want priestly authority? Okay, do the priest thing. Let's see what happens. This is where Korah's argument starts to unravel, because he's not actually advocating for distributed leadership. He's advocating for himself and his coalition to have the power that Moses and Aaron currently hold. It's not about eliminating hierarchy. It's about climbing it. Moses then addresses Korah specifically, and his words drip with the exhaustion of someone who has explained this too many times. Isn't it enough that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the community to bring you near himself, to do the work at the Lord's tabernacle, and to stand before the community and minister to them? He has brought you and all your fellow Levites near himself, but now you want the priesthood too. Translation: you already have a prestigious position. You're not a regular Israelite hauling rocks. You're in the inner circle, and it's still not enough. This is the eternal tension in every organization. The people close enough to power to see how it works, but not close enough to wield it themselves. They understand the system well enough to know it's arbitrary, but not well enough to change it without destroying it. The next morning arrives. Korah and his 250 supporters show up with their fire pans, ready to make their unauthorized incense offerings. The entire assembly gathers to watch. This is the Bronze Age equivalent of a shareholder meeting turned hostile takeover attempt. Moses and Aaron stand at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The crowd waits, and God shows up. Not metaphorically. The glory of the Lord appears to the entire assembly, and God tells Moses and Aaron, "Separate yourselves from this assembly so I can put an end to them at once." This is the divine equivalent of "everyone step back, I'm about to do something dramatic." Moses and Aaron immediately fall face down and plead, "O God, the God who gives breath to all living things, will you be angry with the entire assembly when only one man sins?" It's a fascinating moment. Moses, who has been challenged and undermined and second-guessed for 40 years, still intercedes for the people. He's not asking God to spare Korah. He's asking God not to collective punish everyone who showed up to watch. God agrees. The message goes out. Get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Move back. Don't touch anything that belongs to them, or you'll be swept away because of their sins. The crowd backs up. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram stand at the entrances of their tents with their wives, children, and little ones. Everything they own is right there. Their possessions, their families, their entire lives on display. Moses makes a speech. He's done being diplomatic. This is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things and that it was not my idea. If these men die a natural death, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about something totally new, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them with everything that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the realm of the dead, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt. It's a bold claim. Moses is essentially saying, if I'm wrong about my divine appointment, these guys will die of old age eventually. But if I'm right, you're about to see something unprecedented. The moment he finishes speaking, the ground splits open. Not an earthquake, not a sinkhole that had been forming for years. The earth opens its mouth, that's the phrase used, and swallows Korah, Dathan, Abiram, their households, all their possessions, and everyone associated with them. They go down alive into the realm of the dead, and the earth closes over them. Gone. The 250 men who had brought the unauthorized incense. Fire comes out from the Lord and consumes them. The entire assembly flees, screaming, terrified that the earth might swallow them too. The smell of burning flesh mixes with dust and panic. The ground where Korah's tent had stood moments before is now just ground, smooth, unmarked, as if nothing had been there at all. This is not a metaphor about organizational restructuring. This is violent, immediate, and absolute. And you would really, genuinely think, that this would settle the question of Moses' authority. You would be wrong. The next day, the entire Israelite community grumbles against Moses and Aaron. You have killed the Lord's people. Read that again. They watched the earth open and swallow the rebels. They saw fire consume the unauthorized priests. And their takeaway is, Moses killed them. Not God, not divine judgment. Moses. This is the moment that reveals everything about leadership, authority, and human psychology. It doesn't matter what you do or how dramatically God backs you up. If people don't want to accept your authority, they will find a way to blame you for the consequences of defying it. Moses and Aaron turn toward the tent of meeting, and the cloud covers it. The glory of the Lord appears. They go to the front of the tent, and God says to Moses, "Get away from this assembly so I can put an end to them at once." Again, same conversation as yesterday. God is ready to wipe them out. Moses and Aaron fall face down. But this time, Moses doesn't just pray. He acts. He tells Aaron, "Take your censer, put incense in it along with burning coals from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them." Wrath has come out from the Lord. The plague has started. A plague has already begun. People are dying as they stand there. The same people who just accused Moses of killing Korah are now dying of an actual plague, and Moses is trying to save them. Aaron grabs his censer and runs into the middle of the assembly. The plague is spreading through the crowd. People are collapsing. The smell of incense mingles with the smell of death. Aaron stands between the living and the dead, making atonement, and the plague stops. 14,700 people die just from the plague, not counting Korah's faction from the day before. Aaron stands there, holding his censer, surrounded by bodies, having just stopped a divine plague through the exact priestly authority that Korah claimed was unjustly monopolized. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a ceremonial blade. But God isn't finished making the point, because apparently swallowing rebels and sending a plague wasn't quite clear enough. There needs to be a visual aid for future reference. God tells Moses to collect the censers that belonged to the 250 men who were consumed by fire. The censers themselves are holy now. They were presented before the Lord, even if the men offering them were unauthorized. Have them hammered into sheets to overlay the altar as a reminder to Israel that no one except a descendant of Aaron should come to burn incense before the Lord, or they will become like Korah and his followers. So the bronze censers, the physical tools of the rebellion, are beaten flat and used to decorate the altar. Every time someone approaches to make an offering, they see the hammered bronze and remember, this is what happens when you challenge the established religious hierarchy. It's a monument to failed revolution. The text then moves immediately to another sign, because apparently we need additional proof. God tells Moses to have each tribal leader bring a staff with their name written on it. Aaron's name goes on the staff for Levi. Place all 12 staffs in the tent of meeting overnight. The next morning, Aaron's staff has budded, blossomed, and produced almonds. Not just budded, the entire life cycle of an almond tree happened overnight. Buds, blossoms, and ripe almonds all on the same dead wooden staff. The message is clear. Aaron's authority isn't political. It's not about Moses playing favorites. It's organic, divinely ordained, literally fruitful. The other staffs, still dead wood. Moses brings all the staffs out and shows them to the people. Each leader takes back his own staff, and Aaron's staff is placed before the ark as a permanent reminder. Another monument, another memorial to don't try this again. And the people's response? We will die. We are lost. We are all lost. Anyone who even comes near the tabernacle of the Lord will die. Are we all going to die? They've gone from Moses has too much power to we're all going to die if we get near the holy things. The rebellion wanted more access to the sacred. The result is everyone is now terrified of the sacred. This is what happens when you challenge authority through spectacle. The response has to be even more spectacular. And once you've established that the ground can open and swallow people, that plagues can start spontaneously. That dead wood can produce fruit overnight. You haven't distributed power. You've concentrated it further and added existential terror to the mix. Korah wasn't wrong that Moses and Aaron had consolidated authority. He wasn't wrong that the system was hierarchical. He wasn't wrong that claims of divine appointment are conveniently unfalsifiable. But he was wrong about the solution, because you can't democratize a theocracy. You can't vote on whether God chose Aaron. You can't negotiate with someone who has divine backing unless the divine is willing to negotiate too. And in this case, the divine was not interested in power-sharing agreements. The tragedy of Korah's rebellion isn't that he challenged authority, it's that his challenge forced an escalation that made the authority even more absolute, even more untouchable, even more backed by supernatural violence. Before Korah, you could maybe question Moses' decisions. After Korah, questioning Moses means risking the earth opening beneath your feet. Before Korah, the priesthood was Aaron's family privilege. After Korah, it's literally the only family whose staffs produce almonds overnight, and everyone else's proximity to the sacred is a death sentence. The rebellion didn't redistribute power. It clarified exactly who had it and what would happen if you forgot. And the people who complained that Moses killed Korah, 14,700 of them learned that the problem wasn't Moses. The problem was assuming that divine backing could be argued with. You literally cannot win. Korah couldn't win by challenging. The people couldn't win by complaining about the challenge. Moses couldn't win because even when God vindicated him spectacularly, people still blamed him for the consequences. The only winner, if you can call it that, is the system itself. The hierarchy survived. The priesthood remained exclusive. The authority remained concentrated. And somewhere in the camp, future potential rebels looked at the hammered bronze covering the altar and thought, maybe I'll just keep my head down. Picture this. You've been wandering in the desert for 38 years. 38 years. The original plan, the exciting march from Egypt to Canaan, the promised land flowing with milk and honey, that was supposed to take 11 days. 11 days. Instead, you've spent nearly 4 decades watching the same rocks, eating the same manna, and attending funerals. So many funerals, because that's what happens when God sentences an entire generation to die in the wilderness. People die constantly. And when people die constantly, you develop a corpse contamination problem. This is where we find ourselves in Numbers 19, year 38 of the wilderness wandering. And someone in the leadership team has decided what this situation really needs is a comprehensive policy document about ritual purity after contact with dead bodies. Not better food, not a route change, not even a motivational speech about how they're almost done dying and the next generation will totally get to see Canaan. No, what they need is a red heifer, not just any cow, a red heifer, specifically a female cow that is completely red. No white hairs, no black spots, no blemishes of any kind. And that has never worn a yoke, never pulled a plow, never done a single day's work. You're going to burn this perfect unemployed red cow to make special purification water. Let that sink in for a moment. The logic goes like this. When you touch a dead body, you become ritually impure for 7 days. This is a problem when people are dying constantly and someone has to handle the bodies. The solution? Burn an unblemished red heifer along with cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet thread. Collect the ashes, mix the ashes with water, sprinkle the water on the contaminated person on the 3rd day and the 7th day. Boom. Purified. The instructions are incredibly specific. The cow must be taken outside the camp, not just to the edge, but outside, and slaughtered in front of Eleazar the priest. Not Aaron, Eleazar, Aaron's son, because apparently Aaron himself would become too holy or too contaminated or something. The text doesn't explain. It just specifies Eleazar, and you get the sense that someone on the committee felt very strongly about this particular detail. Eleazar takes some of the blood and sprinkles it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. 7 times. Not 6, not 8, 7. Then the entire cow, hide, flesh, blood, intestines, the works, gets burned while Eleazar watches. While it's burning, someone throws in cedar wood, hyssop, and a scarlet thread. The text doesn't say who throws them in. Probably an intern. The smell must have been extraordinary. Burning cow is not a subtle aroma. It's a thick, meaty, greasy smoke that clings to your clothes and hair and follows you home. Add in the cedar, that sharp, resinous sweetness, and the hyssop, which is an herb that smells vaguely medicinal, like something your grandmother would make you drink when you had a cough. The scarlet thread probably didn't smell like much, but it definitely added visual drama as it curled and blackened in the flames. You stand there, downwind, breathing through your mouth. It doesn't help. the ashes get collected by someone who is ceremonially clean. This person, by virtue of collecting the ashes, immediately becomes ceremonially unclean until evening. They store the ashes outside the camp in a ceremonially clean place. Pause here. The ashes themselves are clean. The person who collected them is now unclean. The ashes will be used to make people clean. But first, they make you unclean. This is the bureaucratic equivalent of a Mobius strip. When someone touches a corpse, you take some of these ashes, mix them with fresh water in a jar, and sprinkle the contaminated person on the 3rd day and the 7th day. After the 7th day, they wash their clothes, bathe, and by evening they're clean. Unless they don't follow the procedure exactly, then they remain unclean and must be cut off from the community. The penalty for not performing the red heifer ritual correctly is exile. For context, the penalty for murder, according to earlier rules, was execution or fleeing to a city of refuge. The penalty for not sprinkling yourself with ash water after touching Great Aunt Miriam's body was permanent exile. Priorities. Now, the gentle cynic in us must ask, why? Why this elaborate ritual? Why the specific color of the cow? Why Eleazar instead of Aaron? Why 7 sprinkles instead of a reasonable number like 3? The answer, if we're honest, is that nobody knows. The text doesn't explain the reasoning. Later, rabbis would call this a chok, a law without rational explanation, given purely to test obedience. The medieval commentator Rashi admitted he didn't understand it. Maimonides took a stab at it, suggesting it was meant to wean people off idolatrous practices involving red animals. Modern scholars think it might be a ritual borrowed from earlier Canaanite or Egyptian purification rites, repurposed and Israelite branded. But here's what we do know. By year 38 in the desert, the organizational structure has become so complex that it requires complex solutions to problems the structure itself created. Let me explain. In the beginning, back in Exodus, during the exciting liberation phase, the rules were simpler. Don't murder, don't steal, don't worship other gods, keep the Sabbath, straightforward stuff. Then they built the tabernacle, and suddenly you needed rules about who could touch what. The Levites could carry the holy furniture, but only after the priest covered it. Regular Israelites couldn't even look at the holy objects or they'd die. This created a purity system. Some people were clean, some were unclean, and there were rules about how to transition between states. But then people started dying. A lot. Because God had sentenced the entire first generation to die in the wilderness. So now you had a situation where people were constantly touching corpses, family members, friends, neighbors, and constantly becoming unclean. If you're unclean, you can't approach the tabernacle. You can't participate in sacrifices. You can't be part of the community's religious life. So they needed a purification ritual. But it couldn't be too easy. That would undermine the whole purity system. It had to be elaborate enough to feel significant, rare enough to feel special, and weird enough to feel divinely ordained. Enter the red heifer. The red heifer ritual is what happens when an organization creates rules to solve problems created by earlier rules, which were themselves solutions to problems created by the original rules. It's bureaucratic sedimentation. And here's the thing. Once you establish this kind of procedure, you can't just abandon it. Because if the red heifer ritual is optional, then maybe all the purity laws are optional. And if the purity laws are optional, then maybe the Levitical hierarchy is optional. And if that's optional, then what exactly is Moses' authority based on? So the red heifer stays. They're going to be burning red heifers for the next 1,000 years, long after they leave the desert, long after they settle in Canaan, long after the tabernacle becomes the temple. The ritual will continue because the ritual must continue because the system requires it. The Talmud later records that only 9 red heifers were ever burned in all of Jewish history, from Moses to the destruction of the Second Temple. 9 in 1500 years, which means they were incredibly rare, which means most people who became corpse contaminated probably just waited it out or found some other workaround, which means the whole elaborate ritual was more theoretical than practical. But it was on the books, and that mattered, because by year 38 in the desert, what mattered wasn't solving problems efficiently. What mattered was maintaining the system. Chapter 19 isn't alone in this. Numbers is littered with random regulations that appear seemingly out of nowhere, solve hyper-specific problems, and never get mentioned again. There's a rule about what to do if you accidentally make a vow to God and then realize you can't fulfill it. Spoiler, you're in trouble. There's a detailed procedure for what to do if someone dies suddenly in the presence of a Nazirite, someone who has taken a vow not to cut their hair or drink wine. They have to shave their head, wait 7 days, bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons to the priest, and start their vow over from scratch. The hair gets burned. The days already completed don't count. There's a regulation about what to do with the firstborn donkey. You redeem it with a lamb, or if you don't want to redeem it, you break its neck. These are your 2 options: lamb or neck breaking. The text doesn't explain why donkeys specifically need this treatment. Horses don't, camels don't, just donkeys. There are rules about the order in which tribes should march when the camp moves. Judah goes first, obviously, then Issachar and Zebulun, then the Levites carrying the tabernacle, then Reuben, Simeon, and Gad, then more Levites with the holy objects, then Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, then Dan, Asher, and Naphtali bringing up the rear. This marching order gets described in excruciating detail in chapter 10. Precise formations, specific trumpet signals for different movements. 2 short blasts mean the camps on the east side move out. 1 long blast means everyone gather for assembly. They're creating a procedural manual for a march that's going in circles. For 38 years, the trumpet signals are technically impressive. The marching order is logistically sound. The regulations are comprehensive. And none of it matters because they're not going anywhere. This is the heart of what's happening in the middle sections of Numbers. The first generation is dying off slowly. The second generation isn't old enough to take over yet. And in the meantime, the leadership is creating policies. Policies about purity, policies about marching, policies about vows and donkeys and inheritance and offerings and festival calendars. It's productive paralysis. When you can't move forward and you can't go back, you create procedures. You refine the org chart. You update the handbook. You establish protocols. You burn a red heifer and pretend it's progress. And here's the thing. The people going through this probably didn't see it as absurd. To them, these rules were sacred, divinely mandated, part of the covenant that made them special. The red heifer wasn't a bureaucratic overreach. It was a gift, a way to maintain purity even in the midst of death, a connection to the holy even when everything felt profane. The marching order wasn't pointless. It was identity, a reminder that they were still organized, still a people, still moving towards something even if that something was just tomorrow. The regulations weren't random. They were structure in a structureless void. From inside the system, it made sense. It's only from outside, from a few thousand years away, reading the text with gentle cynicism, that we can see the pattern. Every organization does this. every movement that lasts long enough eventually creates a red heifer ritual. You start with a simple mission. Then you create rules to protect the mission. Then you create rules to clarify the rules. Then you create procedures to implement the rules. Then you create committees to oversee the procedures. Then you create regulations to govern the committees. And 40 years later, you're burning a perfectly red cow to make magic purification water, and everyone's pretending this was the plan all along. The Israelites didn't invent this. They just wrote it down in more detail than most. By the time we reach chapter 19, Moses has been leading these people for nearly 4 decades. He's watched an entire generation die. He's mediated countless disputes. He's delivered laws and regulations and judgments until his voice is hoarse. And now he's explaining, with apparent seriousness, that they need to find a cow that has never had a single white hair, burn it outside camp, collect the ashes, store them in a ceremonially clean place, and use them to make corpse contamination spray. You have to wonder if some small part of him, deep down, in a place he'd never admit, thought this was getting a bit silly. But he delivers the instructions anyway, because that's what leaders do. They maintain the system even when the system has become its own purpose. The ashes of the red heifer would be kept for generations, carefully guarded, precisely measured, used sparingly because you couldn't just burn another one whenever you wanted. Finding a perfectly red cow was nearly impossible. Rarity became proof of value. Complexity became proof of divinity. And somewhere in the desert, year 38 of the wandering, a perfectly red heifer went up in smoke, and everyone agreed this made perfect sense. We're in year 39 now. 39 years of wandering. You can tell because everyone's tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. The original generation, the ones who actually remembered Egypt, who saw the plagues, who walked through the Red Sea on dry ground, they're almost all dead. Not dramatically, just gradually. One funeral at a time until the revolution became a memory, became a story your parents told. Moses is old. Aaron is old. Miriam just died. And everyone is starting to realize that the people who actually knew what they were doing are leaving. And what remains is a second generation raised on stories about a place they've never seen, led by leaders who are running on fumes and divine mandate. This is when things get weird. Not weird like the talking donkey we'll get to. Weird like when organizations start making decisions that only make sense if you understand they're in crisis mode, and nobody wants to admit it. Let's start with the rock. The people are thirsty. Again, this is not new. They've been thirsty approximately 400 times over the past 4 decades. Water in the desert is always a concern, and complaining about it has become a beloved pastime. A tradition, really. Something to pass down to your children, along with your tent poles and your lingering resentment. Moses has handled this before. Back in Exodus, God told him to strike a rock with his staff, and water came out. Miracle performed, crisis averted. Everyone moved on to the next complaint. Simple, repeatable, a process. But now we're at Kadesh, and the people are thirsty again. And they're doing that thing where they romanticize the past while complaining about the present. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to this terrible place, they ask. It has no grain or figs, no grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Notice the specificity. They're not just complaining about lacking water, they're itemizing everything they don't have. Grain, figs, grapevines, pomegranates. This is a complaint that's been workshopped, refined, passed around the camp until everyone agreed on the talking points. Moses and Aaron do what they always do when the complaints get loud enough. They fall face down at the entrance to the tent of meeting. This is their version of submitting a ticket to IT and waiting for a response. God's response: take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. Speak to it, not strike it. Speak. This is important. God is updating the process. New miracle, new method. It's a teaching moment. Moses is supposed to demonstrate that God's provision comes through words now, not violence. It's symbolic. It's meaningful. Moses does not care about the symbolism. Moses is tired. Miriam just died. The people are complaining about pomegranates. He's 120 years old, and he's been managing this crowd for 4 decades, and he has had enough. He gathers the assembly. He lifts his staff, and he says, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then he hits it. Twice. Water comes out. Lots of it. The miracle works. The people drink. Crisis averted. God is furious. Not about the water. The water's fine. God's upset because Moses just improvised during a carefully planned demonstration. He hit the rock when he was supposed to speak to it. He called the people rebels. He said, "Must we bring you water?" taking credit for something God was doing. The punishment is immediate and brutal. Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. 40 years. 40 years Moses has been leading these people. 40 years of complaints, rebellions, plagues, and administrative nightmares. 40 years of mediating between an impatient God and an ungrateful population. And now, 3 miles from the finish line, he's disqualified because he hit a rock instead of talking to it. The gentle cynic observes, "This is what happens when founders stay too long." Moses wasn't wrong to be angry. The people were being difficult. But he'd stopped being able to separate his own frustration from God's message. And that's when leaders become liabilities. The tragedy is that Moses knows it. He doesn't argue. He doesn't appeal. He just accepts it. Because deep down, he's probably exhausted and maybe a little relieved that someone else will have to finish this. But first, more tragedy. Aaron dies next, not from plague or rebellion or snakebite, just dies. Old age, natural causes. The kind of death that only seems natural because you've watched so many people die violently that peacefully on a mountain feels like winning. God tells Moses to take Aaron and his son Eleazar up Mount Hor. There, Moses removes Aaron's priestly garments and puts them on Eleazar. Aaron dies on the mountain. Eleazar comes down wearing his father's clothes. The whole community mourns for 30 days. This is significant. When Miriam died, there was no mention of mourning. But Aaron gets 30 days. Perhaps because he was the high priest. Perhaps because he was the last of the original leadership trio. Perhaps because everyone suddenly realized that the people who actually remembered Egypt were disappearing, and soon there would be no one left who could say, "I was there," with any authority. The organizational anxiety is palpable. You can feel it in how the text rushes through Aaron's death. No long farewell speech, no final words of wisdom. Just, he died. His son wore his clothes. Everyone was sad for a month. Moving on, because they have to move on. The Canaanites attack from the south. Israel wins, destroys some cities, moves forward. The text gives this battle maybe 3 verses, which tells you everything about the emotional state of the narrator. We've been wandering for 40 years, and now suddenly we're fighting battles and destroying cities, and nobody has time to process any of this. because if we stop moving, we might realize how absurd this all is. And then, the snakes. The people complain again. Same complaint, different location. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food. The miserable food is manna, the miraculous bread from heaven that has kept them alive for 40 years. They detest it. They've moved past ingratitude into active contempt for the divine provision that has sustained them. God's response is immediate and Old Testament. Venomous snakes. Not metaphorical snakes. Not a plague that resembles snakes. Actual snakes. Poisonous ones. They bite the people. Many Israelites die. The people, suddenly regretting their food criticism, come to Moses. We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us. Moses prays. God's solution is magnificently weird. Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. Read that again. God sends snakes to punish the people for complaining. Then, instead of removing the snakes, God tells Moses to make a bronze snake, put it on a pole, and tell people that if they look at the bronze snake after being bitten by a real snake, they won't die. The snakes remain. The danger persists. But now there's a ritual that saves you. Moses, to his credit, doesn't question this. He makes a bronze snake, puts it on a pole, and sure enough, anyone who got bitten by a snake and then looked at the bronze snake lived. Let's sit with how strange this is. God just told Moses he couldn't enter Canaan because he hit a rock instead of speaking to it, because the method matters, because Moses needed to demonstrate trust in God's specific instructions. And now, barely a chapter later, God's specific instruction is make a metal snake statue and tell people to look at it for healing. This is the same religion that will later become absolutely obsessed with not making graven images. The second commandment explicitly forbids making idols. And here's Moses, on God's direct orders, crafting a bronze serpent and telling people it has healing power. The cognitive dissonance is intentional. This is what desperation looks like. The snakes are real. The deaths are real. The solution doesn't have to make sense. It just has to work. And it does work, which means the bronze serpent becomes sacred, which means it endures for centuries until King Hezekiah finally destroys it, because people started worshipping it. That's the pattern. Crisis creates ritual. Ritual becomes tradition. Tradition becomes idol. Someone eventually has to destroy the idol. Repeat. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. They keep moving. Through Moab, around Edom, past territories that don't want them there but also don't want to fight them. Because word has gotten out that this wandering horde has divine backing and a track record of winning battles they shouldn't. And then we meet Balak. Balak is the king of Moab. He's nervous. He's watched Israel destroy the Amorites. He's seen them camp in his plains. He knows he can't beat them militarily. So he decides to try something different. Spiritual warfare. He sends for Balaam. Balaam is a prophet. Not an Israelite prophet, a professional. He's the kind of person you hire when you need someone to bless your crops or curse your enemies or interpret dreams. He's expensive. He's good at his job. He has a reputation. Balak's message is straightforward. A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people, because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps then I will be able to defeat them and drive them away. For I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed. This is magnificent. Balak knows he can't win a military victory, so he's outsourcing the problem to a spiritual consultant. He's hiring a prophet like you'd hire a PR firm. We can't beat them in battle, but maybe we can beat them in the cosmic court of public opinion. Balaam's response is measured. He tells the messengers to spend the night while he consults with God. Professional, careful. He's not saying yes or no until he checks with his sources. God speaks to Balaam that night. Do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people, because they are blessed. Clear answer. Balaam tells the messengers no. They leave. Balak sends more distinguished messengers with a better offer. More money, more honor, the full VIP treatment. Balaam's response is admirably principled. Even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God. But then he adds, stay here tonight, and I'll find out what else the Lord will tell me. This is where it gets interesting. God already said no, clearly, definitively. But Balaam asks again, perhaps hoping for a different answer, perhaps thinking the increased offer changes the equation. God's response is strange. Since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you. Permission granted, sort of, with conditions. Balaam saddles his donkey and goes, and God is angry that he went. Let's pause here because this is genuinely confusing. God said, don't go. Then God said, go, but only do what I say. Then God got angry that he went. This is either a divine test of Balaam's discernment, or the text has been edited by multiple people with different theological agendas, or God is deliberately creating an impossible situation to make a point. The gentle cynic suspects all three. What happens next is one of the most absurd scenes in all of Scripture. Balaam is riding his donkey toward Moab. An angel of the Lord stands in the road with a drawn sword. Balaam doesn't see the angel. The donkey does. The donkey turns off the road into a field. Balaam beats the donkey to get it back on track. They continue. The angel stands in a narrow path between two vineyards with walls on both sides. The donkey sees the angel, presses close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. Balaam beats the donkey again. They continue. The angel stands in an even narrower place where there's no room to turn. The donkey sees the angel and lies down. Balaam beats the donkey with his staff. And then, magnificently, impossibly, the Lord opens the donkey's mouth, and it speaks. What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times? The donkey is using reasonable rhetorical questions. The donkey has adopted the tone of someone who is genuinely confused about why they're being punished. The donkey sounds like every employee who's ever been blamed for their boss's bad decision. Balaam, to his credit, doesn't react to the fact that his donkey is talking. He just responds, as if this is normal, as if donkeys talk all the time, and he's simply annoyed that this particular donkey is being difficult. You have made a fool of me, he says. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now. The donkey's response is perfect. Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you? No, Balaam admits. It's at this point that the Lord opens Balaam's eyes, and he sees the angel standing in the road with a drawn sword. Balaam falls face down. The angel's message: I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared it. Let's appreciate the layers here. God told Balaam to go. Balaam went. God sent an angel to kill him for going. The angel was invisible to Balaam but visible to his donkey. The donkey saved Balaam's life 3 times. Balaam beat the donkey 3 times for saving his life. Then the donkey talked, and Balaam had a conversation with it without questioning the fact that donkeys don't normally talk. And And the moral of the story is, what exactly? That animals see spiritual truth more clearly than prophets, that God's permission isn't the same as God's approval, that even when you think you're doing what God said, you might be on a reckless path. Or perhaps the point is simpler. When nothing makes sense anymore, when your leaders are dying and snakes are biting and the future is uncertain, sometimes the only thing you can do is tell a story about a talking donkey and trust that the absurdity itself contains meaning. Balaam continues to Moab. Balak takes him up to a high place where he can see the Israelite camp. They build 7 altars. They sacrifice bulls and rams. Everything is prepared for the curse. Balaam opens his mouth to curse Israel. What comes out is a blessing. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? Balak is understandably upset. What have you done to me? I brought you to curse my enemies, but you have done nothing but bless them. Balaam's response: must I not speak what the Lord puts in my mouth? They try again. Different location. 7 more altars, more sacrifices. Maybe the first spot had bad spiritual reception. Maybe if they move to a different mountain, the signal will be clearer. Balaam opens his mouth. Another blessing, longer this time, more poetic. God is not human, that he should lie, not a human being, that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? Balak is getting desperate. Neither curse them at all, nor bless them at all. But Balaam can't stop. They try a third time, 3rd mountain, 7 more altars. By now, this is just bureaucratic repetition, the organizational equivalent of turning it off and on again, hoping for different results. 3rd blessing, even more elaborate. This one includes the famous line, "A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel." 4 attempts, 4 blessings. Balak has now paid a premium prophet to bless his enemies 4 times in increasingly poetic language. The gentle cynic notes, this is what happens when you try to manipulate divine will through procedure. Balak thought, if he got the ritual right, the correct number of altars, the proper sacrifices, the ideal location, he could force the outcome he wanted. But the ritual was never the point. The blessing was already there. All Balaam did was reveal it. So what are we supposed to do with all this? Moses hits a rock and loses everything. Snakes bite people until they look at a bronze snake. A donkey talks. A prophet hired to curse Israel can't stop blessing them. These aren't random stories. They're the narrative equivalent of a stress fracture. This is what the end of an era looks like. The founders are dying. The original vision is fading. The second generation is inheriting a movement they didn't start, heading toward a land they've never seen, following leaders who won't be there when they arrive. Nothing makes sense because nothing can make sense. The old rules don't work anymore. Moses can't enter Canaan. Aaron is dead. The bronze serpent saves people even though it's technically an idol. A foreign prophet speaks God's truth, while God's own people complain about the food. The absurdity is the point. When everything you've built is ending, when the people who held it together are leaving, when you're between the wilderness and the promise, this is when the weird stories emerge. Not because they're true in a historical sense, but because they're true in a deeper sense. The donkey sees what the prophet can't see. The curse becomes a blessing. The rock gives water even when you hit it wrong. The snake that kills you becomes the snake that heals you. It's all falling apart and somehow still working. And perhaps that's the real miracle. Not that the donkey talked, or the serpent healed, or the prophet blessed. The miracle is that they kept going, kept moving, kept building, even when their leaders failed them. even when nothing made sense, even when the snakes were still there and all they had was a bronze statue and a promise that looking at it would be enough. They looked, and it was. 40 years have passed. Let me say that again, because it's easy to gloss over. 40 years. You know what happens in 40 years? Everything. Children become adults. Adults become elderly. The elderly become memories. Technologies change. Fashion cycles through twice. That song you couldn't escape becomes a nostalgia track, becomes something your kids find on a retro playlist. In the desert, 40 years means almost everyone who started this journey is dead. The people who walked out of Egypt singing victory songs, gone. The generation that complained about the manna, buried somewhere in the Sinai. The rebels who sided with Korah, long gone, along with everyone who whispered support for his middle management coup attempt. Moses looks out at the camp and sees faces he doesn't recognize. These are the children, the grandchildren, the people who were born in transit, whose entire existence has been sand, tents, and stories about a land they've never seen. And God says, count them again. Because apparently, what this moment needs, what this transition from one generation to the next desperately requires, is another census, more spreadsheets, more tribal tallies, more administrative tedium at a moment of profound generational loss. You can almost hear Moses sighing. He's 120 years old at this point. He's been leading these people for 4 decades. He's watched an entire generation die off, one funeral at a time. And now God wants him to count their replacements like he's updating an employee database. But here's the thing about the second census that makes it different from the first. The first census, back in Numbers chapter 1, was about organization. It was about turning a chaotic liberation movement into something manageable, something you could divide into tribes and units and marching orders. It was bureaucracy. This second census, it's about inheritance. They're counting people so they know who gets what when they finally cross the Jordan. They're dividing land they don't yet possess among people who haven't yet conquered it, based on family sizes that might change by the time they arrive. It's the ultimate act of faith if you're feeling generous, or the ultimate act of denial if you're not. The numbers come in, tribe by tribe, clan by clan, family by family. And if you compare the totals to the first census, you notice something quietly devastating. The total population is almost exactly the same. 601,730 in the first census, 601,730 in the second, give or take a few hundred, which means that for 40 years, through plagues, snake attacks, divine punishment, rebellion, and the ordinary attrition of desert life, the population stayed stable. People died. Babies were born. The numbers balanced. It's the most depressing kind of equilibrium. A whole generation turned over, and the spreadsheet barely changed, but the names changed. Oh, the names changed entirely. You read through the tribal lists, and with a few exceptions, Caleb, Joshua, Moses, Aaron, though Aaron won't make it much longer. Everyone is new. The continuity is structural, not personal. The tribes endure. The families persist. The organization survives. The people, temporary. Which brings us to 5 women who are not interested in being erased by administrative oversight. Their names, Mahla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, the daughters of Zelophehad. Their father had died in the wilderness. Not during Korah's rebellion. They're very clear about this, which suggests that being associated with Korah's failed coup was still a social liability decades later. He died for his own sin, they explain. Just regular sin. Personal brand sin. Nothing political. But he died without sons. And here's where the inheritance laws, as they currently existed, created a problem that nobody had bothered to solve. Land was passed down through male heirs. No sons, no inheritance. Your family's portion, the land you were supposed to receive in Canaan, the land your father had been promised, the land that justified 40 years of wandering, would be absorbed back into the tribe and redistributed to families who did have sons. Your father's name would disappear from the property records. It would be as if he had never existed. And Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah said, absolutely not. They didn't stage a rebellion. They didn't complain to each other in their tents and hope someone else would fix it. They walked straight to the entrance of the tent of meeting, the place where Moses met with God, the holiest administrative center in the camp, and they made their case in public, in front of Moses, Eleazar the priest, the tribal leaders, and the entire assembly. Can we pause to appreciate the audacity of this moment? 5 women, in a patriarchal society, in a religious community, where God had recently been smiting people for minor procedural violations, walked up to the leadership and said, "Your system is broken, and we're here to fix it." Their argument was simple. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan? Because he had no son. Give us property among our father's relatives. Notice the framing. They didn't argue for gender equality as an abstract principle. They didn't challenge the entire inheritance system. They argued within the system's own logic. You say you care about preserving family names. Then preserve ours. You say land should stay within tribal boundaries. Then give us our father's portion so it stays in the family. You want continuity. We are the continuity. It's a masterclass in strategic advocacy. And Moses, to his credit, doesn't dismiss them, doesn't tell them to go home and let the men handle property law, doesn't invoke tradition or divine order or the way things have always been done. He brings their case before the Lord, which is Moses speak for, "I have no idea what to do here, and I'm not making this decision alone." And God responds with something that must have shocked everyone listening. What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right, not, "I'll make an exception this once," not, "Fine, but don't make a habit of this." Right, the law was wrong, and they were right, and the law needs to change. God gives Moses a new legal framework on the spot. If a man dies without sons, his daughters inherit. If he has no daughters, it goes to his brothers. No brothers. His father's brothers. No uncles. The nearest relative in the clan. It's a cascading inheritance structure designed to keep land within families and tribes. And it happened because 5 women refused to accept that their father's name should be erased from the records. But here's where it gets complicated, because legal reforms always get complicated. Later, much later, near the end of Numbers, after wars and rituals and more censuses, the leaders of Zelophehad's tribe come to Moses with a concern. If these women inherit land and then marry men from other tribes, the land transfers to their husbands' tribes, which means land could leak out of one tribe and into another, which defeats the whole purpose of keeping inheritance within tribal boundaries. It's a legitimate legal problem, and it reveals the tension at the heart of this entire system. You can't simultaneously preserve family names and maintain rigid tribal boundaries when women marry across tribal lines. Something has to give. God's solution? The daughters of Zelophehad can inherit, but they must marry within their father's tribe. It's a compromise, a restriction on their freedom to marry whomever they want in exchange for the right to inherit at all. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah agree. They marry cousins within their tribe. The land stays put, and the legal precedent stands. But let's sit with the weight of what just happened. 5 women changed the law. Not by revolution, not by violence, not by divine miracle or prophetic intervention. By showing up and making a case that the system's own logic couldn't refute. And the system adapted. It didn't crumble. It didn't collapse. It bent just enough to accommodate a reality it hadn't previously considered. Which brings us back to the second census and the deeper irony embedded in this entire section. They are counting people and dividing land for a future they will not personally experience. Moses won't enter Canaan. He knows this. God told him after the rock hitting incident. He'll see it from a distance, and then he'll die. The entire generation that left Egypt won't enter Canaan. That was the whole point of the 40-year delay. They were deemed unworthy, too complaint-prone, too stuck in slave mentality. And yet here they are, creating detailed property laws, establishing inheritance rules, dividing portions of land they'll never farm among families whose children haven't been born yet. It's the most human thing they've done in 40 years, because this is what humans do. We plant trees we'll never sit under. We write laws for societies we won't live to see. We build systems, knowing we're temporary, but hoping the systems aren't. The first generation spent 40 years wandering, complaining, dying in the wilderness. The second generation will spend their early years learning property boundaries for land they haven't yet conquered. And the poignant, almost unbearably tender irony is this. The first generation's final act of leadership is to create structures that assume their own absence. They're not pretending they'll be there. They're not clinging to relevance. They're saying, here's how it should work when we're gone. The daughters of Zelophehad understood this better than anyone. Their father was gone, but his name didn't have to disappear. His portion could endure, not because he was still alive, but because they insisted that his absence didn't erase his existence. And that's what the second census is really about. It's not just counting people, it's counting the future. It's saying, we know we won't be there, but here's who should get what. Here's how the land should be divided. Here's how disputes should be resolved. Here's how you preserve family names even when the family structure changes. It's the opposite of the complaints that filled the earlier chapters. Those complaints were about the present, about discomfort, hunger, fear, nostalgia for Egypt. This is about a future the complainers won't inhabit, and the gentle cynic in me wants to note the irony. The generation that couldn't stop complaining about their present circumstances spent their final years building systems for other people's futures. The generation that rebelled against Moses' authority created legal precedents that would outlast them by centuries. The people who wanted to go back to Egypt established property laws for Canaan. It's almost like suffering has a way of making you think beyond yourself. Almost like knowing you won't benefit from the system makes you design it more carefully. Almost like mortality focuses the mind on legacy. Moses stands there 120 years old, updating the census records. He knows he won't cross the Jordan. He knows Joshua will lead them in. He knows the promised land will be inherited by people who never knew slavery, never saw the plagues, never walked through the Red Sea. And he counts them anyway. He divides the land anyway. He updates the inheritance laws anyway. Because that's what leaders do when they finally understand their role isn't to be indispensable. It's to make themselves obsolete. The numbers are recorded. The portions are assigned. The daughters of Zelophehad received their inheritance in writing, a legal precedent that will echo through Israelite law for generations. And somewhere in the desert, beneath unmarked graves, the first generation rests. They didn't make it, but the systems they built in their final years, Those crossed the Jordan just fine. We've spent 40 years in the desert watching a liberation movement slowly transform into something else entirely. We've seen the revolution become administration. We've watched charismatic leadership collapse into bureaucracy. We've observed the people who fled Egypt with nothing but hope and unleavened bread slowly, methodically, create the same hierarchical structures they once escaped. And now, at the end of Numbers, we arrive at the part everyone tries to skip over. The part that doesn't fit neatly into Sunday school flannel boards. The part where the gentle cynic has to take a breath and acknowledge what's actually written here. War, vengeance, conquest, and very detailed property law. The book of Numbers ends not with a triumphant entry into the promised land, but with a series of military campaigns, territorial negotiations, and the establishment of legal codes for a society that doesn't exist yet. It's practical, it's brutal, and it's exactly what happens when idealism meets geography. Let's start with the Midianites. Chapter 31 opens with God telling Moses to execute the Lord's vengeance on Midian. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't symbolic warfare. This is God ordering the systematic destruction of an entire people group. Why the Midianites? Because back in chapter 25, Midianite women had seduced Israelite men into worshipping Baal. 24,000 Israelites died in a plague. Someone had to pay. And in the logic of Bronze Age tribal conflict, vengeance wasn't just acceptable, it was expected. So Moses sends 12,000 men, 1,000 from each tribe, because even vengeance requires proper organizational structure. Led by Phinehas the priest, they kill every Midianite male, every single one. Then they burn the cities. They capture the women and children. They take the livestock. They haul everything back to camp like the world's most disturbing shopping trip. Moses meets them outside the camp. You can imagine the scene. Thousands of soldiers returning with captives, animals, gold, and the kind of traumatic silence that follows large-scale violence. Moses looks at the women and children, and he loses it. "Have you let all the women live?" he asks. Not a question, an accusation. These women caused the Israelites to turn away from the Lord at Peor, so that the plague came upon the Lord's people. His command is clear: kill every male child. Kill every woman who has slept with a man. Keep alive only the young girls who haven't known a man. 32,000 of them, according to the count. The gentle cynic wants to look away here, wants to explain this as ancient context, as cultural difference, as something we can intellectually distance ourselves from. But Numbers doesn't let us. It lists the plunder with the same meticulous detail it used for the tabernacle furniture. 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, 32,000 virgin girls. The text treats them all the same. Inventory, assets, things to be divided according to proper procedure. Half goes to the soldiers who fought. Half goes to the rest of the community. The Levites get their cut. 1 out of every 50 from the community's half. The priests get 1 out of every 500 from the soldiers' portion. Even genocide has a tax code. The officers come to Moses with an observation. They've counted their men. Not a single Israelite soldier died in the battle. Not one. This should be celebrated, right? A miraculous victory with 0 casualties. But the officers understand what this means. They've just participated in mass slaughter without losing a single man. The arithmetic of that is uncomfortable. So they bring an offering. Gold, lots of it. Armlets, bracelets, signet rings, earrings, necklaces, 16,750 shekels worth. The text calls it atonement for themselves before the Lord. Atonement for winning too cleanly. Even they knew something was wrong. This is where the gentle cynic has to pause and acknowledge what we're reading. This isn't a story about good guys defeating bad guys. This is a story about survivors becoming conquerors, about the oppressed becoming oppressors, about people who fled slavery now enslaving others. The pattern is old, older than Israel, older than Egypt. Every revolution eventually becomes what it opposed, just with different uniforms. But Numbers doesn't end with the Midianite massacre. It keeps going because conquest requires administration. The tribes of Reuben and Gad approach Moses with a request. They've noticed that the land east of the Jordan, the territory they've already conquered from the Amorites, is excellent for livestock. And they have livestock, lots of it. So they ask, can we just stay here? Can we settle on this side of the Jordan instead of crossing over into Canaan? Moses, predictably, explodes. Should your fellow Israelites go to war while you sit here? He reminds them of the spies, of the 40-year penalty, of what happens when people lose their nerve at the crucial moment. And here you are, a brood of sinners, standing in the place of your fathers and making the Lord even more angry with Israel. You can hear the exhaustion in his voice. He's 120 years old. He's been managing these people for 4 decades. He's watched an entire generation die in the desert. And now, at the finish line, 2 tribes want to opt out. But Reuben and Gad have done their homework. They don't just ask for land, they propose a solution. We will build pens here for our livestock and cities for our women and children, they say. But we ourselves will arm ourselves and go ahead of the Israelites until we have brought them to their place. Translation: we'll fight, we'll help conquer Canaan, but afterward we're coming back here. Moses considers this. It's actually reasonable. Half the tribe of Manasseh joins the negotiation. They want in on the east side land too. Moses agrees. With conditions, very specific conditions. They must arm themselves. They must cross the Jordan. They must fight until the conquest is complete. Only then can they return to their families. The deal is struck, documented, witnessed, legally binding. The revolution now has real estate contracts. Chapter 33 shifts tone entirely. It's a travel log. Every single place the Israelites camped during their 40 years of wandering. 42 locations, listed with the bureaucratic precision of someone who really wanted to make sure this was documented. Ramesses, Sukkoth, Etham, Pi-Hahiroth, Mara, Elim, the Red Sea, the Desert of Sin, on and on. Place after place, year after year. Most of these locations we know nothing about. They're just names now. Dots on a map that no longer exists. Brief stops in a journey that consumed an entire generation. But someone wrote them down. Someone thought it mattered that they camped at Rissa, then Kehelatha, then Mount Shepher. The gentle cynic sees this for what it is. An old man, looking back, trying to make sense of 4 decades that feel both endless and impossibly brief. Every campsite was someone's home for weeks, months, sometimes years. Every location has stories we'll never hear, births, deaths, arguments, reconciliations, quiet moments of beauty in the midst of waiting. All compressed into a list, a route, a journey that's almost over. Then God speaks to Moses one more time. When you cross the Jordan into Canaan, God says, drive out all the inhabitants, destroy their idols, demolish their high places, take possession of the land. And if you don't, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you will live. This is the language of conquest, not coexistence, not integration, elimination. The text doesn't flinch from this, doesn't soften it, doesn't add a disclaimer. This is what they were told. This is what they believed God commanded. The land is to be divided by lot, proportional to tribal size. Larger tribes get more territory. Smaller tribes get less. There's a mathematical formula for divine distribution. 9.5 tribes will settle west of the Jordan. 2.5 tribes have already claimed the east. The boundaries are described in detail that would make a surveyor weep. From this mountain to that wadi, following this ridge to that landmark, turning at the Sea of Galilee, extending to the Mediterranean. Every border matters. Every boundary is sacred. Every property line is potential conflict. Then comes chapter 35, and suddenly we're talking about cities of refuge. God tells Moses to designate 48 cities for the Levites, the tribe with no land inheritance of their own. 6 of these cities will be special, cities of refuge. Here's how they work. If someone kills another person accidentally, truly accidentally, not murder, they can flee to one of these cities. They'll be safe there from the avenger of blood, the family member who has the right to execute the killer. The accused stays in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. Then they're free to return home. If they leave the city before the high priest dies, the avenger of blood can kill them, no questions asked. If it was murder, not an accident, the community investigates. If found guilty, the murderer is handed over to the avenger of blood. No city can protect them. This is Bronze Age justice, not perfect, not comfortable, but structured. It acknowledges that accidents happen, that vengeance is real, that blood demands blood, but maybe, just maybe, there's a way to interrupt the cycle. The cities of refuge are scattered strategically, 3 on each side of the Jordan, accessible, reachable, a day's journey for someone running for their life. It's practical, it's merciful, and it's absolutely necessary for a society about to settle in one place after 40 years of movement. Because once you stop wandering, conflicts become permanent. Grudges become generational. Violence becomes cyclical. The cities of refuge are an acknowledgement that this new society they're building will be messy. People will die. Some deaths will be intentional. Some won't be. And they need structures to handle both. The final chapter returns to the daughters of Zelophehad, the women who successfully argued for inheritance rights back in chapter 27. The tribal leaders have a concern. If these women inherit their father's land and then marry men from other tribes, the land will transfer to those tribes. The boundaries will blur. The careful division will unravel. God's solution: the daughters can inherit, but they must marry within their father's tribe. The women agree. All 5 of them marry cousins from the tribe of Manasseh. Their names are preserved: Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah. 5 women who challenged the system, won, and then accepted a compromise that secured their victory while maintaining tribal boundaries. It's not a perfect ending, but it's a realistic one. And then Numbers just stops. No triumphant conclusion. No final speech from Moses. No crossing of the Jordan. Just this: these are the commands and regulations the Lord gave through Moses to the Israelites on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. They're still in the desert, still on the wrong side of the river, still waiting. 40 years after leaving Egypt, they've become something entirely different from what they started as. They fled as slaves. They're ending as an organized military force with complex legal codes, property rights, tax structures, and detailed procedures for everything from ritual purity to accidental manslaughter. The revolution succeeded, and in succeeding, It became just another nation, with borders to defend, resources to manage, enemies to eliminate, land to divide. The gentle cynic has watched this pattern before, will watch it again. Every generation convinced their movement is different, their cause is pure, their violence is justified, their structures won't calcify into the very oppression they once fled, and every generation is wrong. But here's what endures: not the certainty, not the purity, not the revolutionary fervor. What endures is the attempt to build something better than what came before, even when that attempt is flawed, violent, compromised, and achingly human. The daughters of Zelophehad are remembered not because they won completely, but because they asked the question. The cities of refuge stand not because they solved violence, but because they acknowledged it and tried to interrupt the cycle. The 42 campsites are listed not because they mattered individually, but because someone thought the journey itself was worth documenting. Numbers ends where it began, with counting, with organization, with the practical work of turning ideals into reality. And reality is always messier than the dream. But the dream doesn't disappear. It transforms. It adapts. It survives in the structures people build for generations they'll never meet. 40 years in the desert. An entire generation gone. A new society emerging from the sand. Not perfect, not pure, not what anyone planned at the beginning, but persistent, documented, enduring long after the certainties crumbled into questions, and the questions settled into the quiet work of building something that might last.